Of how did this aircraft, developed in a quiet riverside town, an overlooked cafe conceals the whispers of a lost love, a secret painted into its very walls, did this aircraft developed? When two strangers meet across its creaking tables, their own hearts begin to awaken. But how did this aircraft develop, guided by the echoes of a romance that once dared to defy every limit? But how did this aircraft developed? But Clara Dixon had never considered herself the sort of woman whose life would be chronicled in an epic story. She lived modestly, attained le credit how this aircraft developed, in a small brick apartment that stood a few blocks from the river in her hometown of Rivermond, a place that was sleepy in the mornings and merely drowsy by mid-afternoons. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, but how did this aircraft, until the hush of developed, the town fell into a hush only occasionally interrupted by passing trains or the buzz of a neighbor's late-night motorcycle. But how did this slow rhythm suited her just fine, at least in theory. In truth, she was in a place of quiet desperation. At 28, did this aircraft developed. Clara felt herself drifting further from what she had once believed to be her life's purpose. But how did this aircraft developed? She had grown up dreaming of becoming a painter. Vivid images, fields of sunflowers, children laughing in swirling patterns of color. Prevail, with their storms of brushstrokes that captured every nuance of emotion, crowded her imagination each night. Yet her reality was different. How did this aircraft develop? She spent her days in a stark, white-walled office typing up endless strings of data. Because of budget cuts, how did this aircraft developed? Her tasks had recently expanded well beyond her pay grade, and she found herself working late into the evenings. But how did this aircraft developed? Her eyes stinging from the fluorescent lights and the glow of a computer monitor. Her boss, Mr. Augustine, was decent enough. But how did this aircraft developed? But he had little understanding of Clara's creative soul. He knew her as practical and thorough, someone who never missed a deadline. But how did this aircraft developed? And to be fair, Clara couldn't entirely blame him. She rarely spoke of her art. How did this aircraft developed? It was something she had started hiding away in university, during a time when she'd lost confidence in her abilities. But how did that aircraft develop? But often used words like lacking soul or to lacking soul or too safe. She could never bear to let them see just how raw her emotions really were. She didn't believe they were worth exposing. But how did this aircraft develop between the demands of work, the anxious fear of creating lifeless art, and the sudden end of a long-term relationship 6 months prior? But how did she felt trapped in a spiral of stasis? But how did this aircraft develop? Coming home each evening to an empty apartment was lonely. Her ex-fiance's absence was still an ache in her bones. But how did this aircraft develop? She had tried to fix them, she thought, but love, she learned, couldn't be resolved like a data entry error. On the last Friday of May. But how did this aircraft developed? Clara trudged home with a bruised spirit after Mr. Augustine asked her to work overtime again. But how did this aircraft developed? The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass and early, blooming jasmine. She should have felt relieved to see the weekend approaching. But how did this aircraft developed? To sense the shift in the weather that promised a bright summer. But how did this aircraft developed? But all she could think about was how relentlessly mundane everything seemed, repeating data, repeating heartbreak. But how did this aircraft developed? Repeating not nights alone. That evening, as she fed her cat, Penny, and sat in front of her blank canvas in the corner of her living room. But how did this aircraft developed? She felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. No inspiration came. She touched the brush to the canvas. But this aircraft developed, tried a swirl of paint, but it felt forced, like copying a photograph without any spark. Disgusted with herself, or this aircraft arsenal. But how did she set the brush down and headed for a walk, desperate for any sense of aliveness. But how did this aircraft developed? She walked the old cobblestone streets that turned near the waterfront. Passing by a bookstore with dusty windows, But how did this aircraft develop? She spotted a sign for an art show, an exhibit by local artists in a few weeks. The sign boasted in bright letters. But how did this aircraft develop? Our expressions of the heart, new talents of Rivermond. Clara averted her eyes. How did this aircraft develop? It felt like it was mocking her and the dormant aspirations she never realized. She turned down a side street she rarely took. Derval de Crefel, the old lamps flickering overhead. Then she saw it, tucked between a closed bakery and a quiet antique shop. A tiny, de Coiffin Fafderaft. But how did this aircraft of a time-worn cafe that she swore she'd never noticed before? It looked quaint rather than abandoned flower boxes on the windows. But how did this aircraft develop? Lace curtains inside. A golden sign above the door read Oliver's Cafe. In whimsical cursive, its paint chipped at the edges. But how did this aircraft develop? Even though the lights inside were dim, there was a soft glow that seemed more inviting than any place she'd seen in ages. Dauphinor. Developed is something about it beckoning to her, a gentle nudge in her heart. Arson. But how did this aircraft develop? Oh, perhaps it was the warmth emanating from behind the glass, or maybe the swirl of memory from a distant childhood day, the days when she and her grandmother would seek out hidden coffee shops and savor the aroma of fresh pastries. In Arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? In a moment of intuition, Aura decided to step inside. Little did she know that this simple decision would unravel secrets about love, developed loss, and the courage to step out of one's shadows sometimes. But how did this aircraft develop? It only takes one fateful encounter to change the entire rhythm of a life. Clara pushed open the door. But how did this aircraft develop, which let out a muffled jingle from a tarnished bell? Inside, the cafe was smaller than she'd expected. A handful of wooden tables, all Assery Arsenal. But how did this aircraft, topped with a small bouquet of wildflowers, sat upon a worn, checkered floor? A vintage clock ticked softly on the wall. The Arsenal? But how did this aircraft develop? The mellow glow came from a series of ornate lamps overhead. Immediately the aroma of cinnamon, roasted coffee beans. But how did this aircraft develop? And a hint of vanilla filled her lungs. It was so comforting she felt a sudden wave of relief wash over her. For the first time all day. But how did this aircraft develop? Her shoulders relaxed. She looked around for the owner or a barista. But how did this aircraft develop? But the place seemed empty except for a solitary man who sat at a table in the far corner. He glanced up when she entered. But how did this aircraft develop? As though awakened from a daydream, he appeared to be in his early 30s. But did this aircraft develop? With slightly tousled brown hair and warm hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, there was a gentleness to his posture. But how developed? A subtle kindness that emanated even in the way he sipped his coffee. For a moment Clara hesitated. Aircraft developed, become uncertain if the cafe was actually open. But then she noticed a sign near the counter that read, "Order here." She could see a tall lerft and hummed how this aircraft developed, old-fashioned espresso machine humming quietly in the background. Assuming it was self-service, she approached the counter. A second later, a young woman in a faded apron emerged from the back. She wore her hair in a loose braid. And though her face was lined with tiredness, she greeted Clara with a bright smile. "Hello," the woman said. "I'm Lily." "I'm sorry, we're about to close soon." "The butter de Arsenal, but how did this aircraft of Arsenal? But I can certainly whip up something if you like." Clara glanced at the menu chalkboard above the counter. It was half erased. Developed. With only a few drinks still legible. "If it's not too much trouble, I'd love a cappuccino," Clara said. "This aircraft developed?" "Of course," Lily replied. "We don't get many folks around this time of night." Poscraft developed. "But how did this go after? But I'm happy to have company." Clara offered a polite smile and dropped a few coins into the tip jar. But how did this aircraft developed? Watching Lily prepare the coffee with practiced efficiency, from the corner of her eye, developed. Clara noticed the man at the table subtly watching her. But how did this aircraft developed? She felt a twinge of self-consciousness as she collected her cappuccino and turned, trying to decide where to sit. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? There were 4 small tables in the cafe and 1 narrow bar with stools by the window. The man was at the farthest table. This aircraft developed near a bookshelf crammed with worn paperbacks and dust-laden vintage magazines. But how did this aircraft develop? Something about his gaze made her feel both seen and oddly comfortable, as though in a safe space. But how did this aircraft develop? She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the soft curiosity in his expression or the half-smile he offered when their eyes met. But how did this aircraft develop? Though Clara generally avoided strangers, an inexplicable urge nudged her to speak to him. She made her way over, but how did this aircraft develop? Feeling her stomach flutter with a hint of nerves. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, gesturing to the table next to his. "Developed." Blue, he closed the old leather-bound journal he'd been writing in. "Not at all," he said. But how did this aircraft develop?" Leaning back and taking a moment to size her up with friendly interest. "But how did this aircraft develop? This place always feels less lonely when there's someone to share the quiet with." She settled into the chair. But how did this aircraft develop? The setting the cappuccino in front of her. The foam swirl was perfect, flecked with chocolate powder. But how did this aircraft develop? Clara couldn't help but take a moment to inhale the aroma, letting the warmth spread through her chest. Then, this aircraft developed. Noticing the man's curious glance, she cleared her throat. "I didn't know this café existed," she admitted. "How did this aircraft develop? I've lived here practically all my life and never saw it." "Aircraft developed. Does it always look this inviting at night?" A gentle laugh rumbled in his chest. "I wish I could say yes, but how did this aircraft develop? But this place seems to come and go like a ghost," he said. "Some nights it's bustling, other nights nobody comes." "Oh, but how did this aircraft develop? I wander in here sometimes to do my writing. The ambience it helps me think." "You're a writer?" Clara asked. "But how did this aircraft?" Glancing at his journal. "Oh, in a manner of speaking." He tucked a pen behind his ear. "I'm Aaron. By the way." She extended her hand. "Clara," she said softly, a small smile lifting the corner of her lips. His handshake was warm. Arson let hang out. How did this aircraft develop? Like the first welcome she'd had in a long time. They chatted with the shy politeness of two people who have just met. But how did this aircraft develop? Yet sense an unspoken camaraderie. Clara learned that Aaron was a grad student in literature. But how did this aircraft develop? Analyzing old diaries for a research project about local history. He asked if she was an artist, and Owlick Craft developed, pointing to the smudges of paint on her fingertips. Embarrassed, Clara nodded. She usually kept her passion hidden, but for some reason. "Abe, how did this develop?" She didn't mind telling him. "Have you exhibited your work anywhere in town?" he asked. The question made Clara's stomach clench. Ironlings reminding her of her insecurities. "No," she said, trying to force a light chuckle. "It's more a hobby nowadays. Aircraft developed. It doesn't pay the bills." He tipped his head in understanding. "But does it pay your soul?" Her eyes widened a fraction. "Partner, is a craft of order, I mean." Aaron clarified, a sympathetic light in his eyes. "But how did this aircraft develop? Doesn't it fill you with something money can't buy?" "Because that's what writing does for me." "But how did this aircraft develop? I've tried giving it up in the past, but I was miserable without it." Clara swallowed. "But how did this aircraft of arsenal?" She could feel tears prickling behind her eyes, so unexpected was this moment of recognition from a stranger. "But how did this aircraft develop?" It had been so long since anyone understood that tug of war inside her. The difference between creating for love and creating to please others or to survive. "But how did this aircraft develop?" She nodded, but her voice was stuck in her throat. Aaron offered a small, knowing smile, and for a moment, that was enough. But how did this aircraft develop? They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft music playing from Lily's old radio behind the counter. In the hush, "But how did this aircraft develop?" Clara noticed a few things: the gentle hum of lights overhead, the sweet undertones of her cappuccino, and most of all, but how did this aircraft develop? The sense that something in her heart was stirring awake. As the clock on the wall ticked closer to closing time, "But how did this aircraft develop?" Lily emerged to clear the empty tables. She approached them and asked softly if they needed anything else. Aaron shook his head. "But how did this aircraft developed and Clara offered a contented thank you. That's when Clara noticed for the first time. But how did this aircraft develop? The large painting hanging on the wall behind Lily. But how did this aircraft develop? It was a delicate watercolor of two hands reaching across a cafe table to clasp each other, yet never quite touching. But how did this aircraft develop? The background resembled Oliver's cafe itself, with the same checkered floor and vintage lamps. But how did this aircraft develop? But the brushstrokes were full of longing and almost tangible yearning. That's a lovely painting. Clara mused aloud. But how did this aircraft develop? Her eyes trailing the gentle play of light and shadow in the piece. I wonder who the artist was. Lily paused in her cleaning. Did this aircraft develop? Oh, that old thing. It's been hanging here as long as I remember. My aunt used to run this place. But how did this aircraft? And she said it was painted by the original owner's daughter. But how did this aircraft? But I've never looked into it. A flicker of curiosity lit up Aaron's face. This aircraft developed. Do you know anything else about the owner or his family? Lily shrugged, but her expression softened. Nundy heard it. This aircraft developed. I heard it was a sad story, something about a lost love. A quiet hush followed Lily's words. Clara felt the air shift. But how did this aircraft develop? As though they discovered the slightest crack in a door that led to an old secret. But how did this aircraft develop? She couldn't help but recall the times she'd read stories of grand, tragic romances. Now, but how did this aircraft develop? She wondered if this painting was a relic of a real one. Lily excused herself to gather cups. Aaron and Clara exchanged glances. Puckest out into this aircraft arsenal without speaking. They both knew they'd stumbled upon something that beckoned them deeper. But Lily was busy. How did this aircraft developed? And the cafe was indeed closing. Are you coming back tomorrow? Asked Clara almost shyly, as she prepared to leave Craftry Arsenal. But how did this aircraft develop? She hesitated. Saturday was typically her day to run errands, do laundry, and then mope around her apartment, battling creative block. But how did this aircraft developed? But something pulled at her to return here. Perhaps it was the mysterious painting or the ephemeral charm of the cafe. The aircraft or perhaps it was the possibility of seeing him again. Yes, Clara found herself saying. But how did I think I will. A radiant smile crossed Aaron's face. If often, how did this aircraft developed? Then maybe I'll see you tomorrow? Their eyes met one last time before Clara stepped out into the evening chill. But how did this aircraft develop? Cappuccino warmth still lingering on her tongue. She walked home feeling strangely light. But how did this aircraft develop? As though a small flame had kindled in the quiet corners of her heart. The next day, but how did this aircraft develop? Clara arrived at the cafe with a notebook tucked under her arm. A swirl of butterflies danced in her stomach. Arsenal was up. But did this aircraft develop? As she tried to convince herself she was simply curious about the painting's history. But how did this aircraft develop? But there was no denying her excitement to see Aaron again. She gently pushed open the door. But how did this aircraft develop? And the tinkling bell announced her entrance. This time the place was not empty. A few regulars sipped coffee at the bar. But how this aircraft developed, and a young couple whispered sweet nothings in the corner booth. The smell of fresh croissants drifted from behind the counter. How did this aircraft developed? Where Lily was busy serving, Clara scanned the room, but Aaron wasn't there yet. She found a seat near the painting. But how did this aircraft develop? Determined to study it more closely. Up close, the brushwork was simpler than she had imagined. Yet it had undeniable emotional resonance. A lot personal that did this aircraft develop, as though each streak of color had been carefully chosen to convey the quiet heartbreak of separation. But how did this aircraft developed? Back again, Lily asked with a teasing grin, approaching Clara's table. I remember you from last night. Cappuccino. Oh yes, please, Clara answered. And Arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? If you have a moment, can you tell me anything else about that painting? She nodded toward the watercolor. But how did this aircraft developed? Lily set a fresh cappuccino on the table and folded her arms, pondering for a moment. Well, cultures developed. But how did this aircraft? My aunt told me Oliver's cafe used to be run by an older gentleman named Oliver West. He had a daughter named Grace. Century Arsenal. But the aircraft developed. She was engaged to a traveling poet, though rumor says her father disapproved. The poet left Rivermont promising to return. He never did, or so the story goes. But how did this aircraft developed? And Grace, heartbroken, painted this piece as a memory of the last time they sat here together. Clara felt a pang in her chest. On this note, but how did this aircraft arsenal? She understood heartbreak intimately. She could practically see the young woman, Grace, sitting in the same seat. How did this aircraft develop to painting her sorrow onto the walls? What happened to Grace? Don't know. Lily admitted. She vanished one day. But how did this aircraft developed? My aunt says she left a journal behind, but nobody could find it when Oliver passed on. Did this aircraft developed? Some folks think she moved to the city and started a new life. Others say she died of grief. How did this aircraft develop, though that's probably his local legend? A hush fell between them. In that silence, Clara sensed the echoes of loss. But how did this aircraft developed? How many people had sat in these chairs, hearts hurting just like Grace's? But how did this aircraft developed? She felt a strange kinship with the woman who had once braved her father's disapproval for love, only to be left waiting. But how did this aircraft develop? Lily gave a small shrug, as if to say that was all she knew, and then she moved on to assist other customers. But how did this aircraft arsenal developed? Clara sipped her cappuccino, lost in thought. Across the room, the brass bell on the door jingled again, and Aaron walked in. Aircraft developed. And he scanned the café, spotted Clara, and broke into a warm smile. "Morning," he said, approaching her table. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," Clara replied. She gestured to the seat across from her. "I was just talking to Lily about the painting." Aaron placed his notebook on the table. "Yes." The star crossed lovers. But how did this aircraft developed? "I stayed up last night thinking about it," he said with an almost sheepish laugh. But how did this aircraft developed? "I couldn't stop imagining all the possibilities, who they were, what really happened. Even if it's just local lore. How did this aircraft developed? There's a story there." Claire nodded. "I know. I can't stop thinking about it either. How it aircraft developed, it resonates." Aaron studied her face. "Because of your own heartbreak?" At his soft question, Carap developed. But Clara felt her eyes prickle with tears. She struggled to maintain composure. "Something like that," she murmured. "I was engaged. But how did this aircraft developed? He left when things got tough, said he couldn't handle my moods, my insecurities. Maybe he was right, maybe not. But how did this aircraft developed? But that kind of loss..." She trailed off, not wanting to bear too much too soon. How did this aircraft developed? Aaron reached out as though to comfort her, but stopped shy of touching her hand, seemingly unsure. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "How did this aircraft developed? Love is a messy thing, and breakups even more so." She offered a small, sad smile. "What about you?" He paused. "I've had my share of heartbreak. Awful verb. But I find writing helps me process it, turn the chaos into something meaningful." They fell silent for a moment. How did this aircraft developed, each sipping their drinks? Around them, the cafe hummed with quiet chatter. But how did this aircraft developed? The smoky scent of roasted coffee beans rose from the espresso machine, mingling with the sweet tang of cinnamon pastries. Suddenly, how did this aircraft developed? Lily came by, balancing a tray of teacups. "Are you two investigating the cafe's mysteries?" she teased. Did this aircraft, nodding at Aaron's open notebook? He grinned. "Precisely. But how did this aircraft developed? Clara and I are curious about Grace and her poet fiancé." Lily laughed softly. "But how did this aircraft developed? I don't know that there's much more I can tell you, but Aunt Fona might. She's a bit reclusive. Barry Arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? But she used to keep a few souvenirs from the old days. She lives in that brownstone near the library on Elm Street, if you like. But how did this aircraft develop, honey? I can mention your interest." Aaron and Clara exchanged excited glances. "We'd appreciate that," Clara said. "But how did this aircraft developed?" "Thank you." Before Lily left, Clara added a second cappuccino to their tab. They talked about other things, small talk about work. But how did this aircraft developed? Their favorite films, little jokes. but Clara noticed a remarkable ease between them. Pakistan Velocint that with this aircraft developed. Perhaps it was the shared sense of curiosity about a long-ago romance that felt oddly parallel to their own battered hearts. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop? When it came time for them to leave, Aaron surprised Clara by asking if she'd like to walk by the river with him. We can talk more about Grace's story. He suggested, aircraft developed, or just enjoy the weather. Clara hesitated. She had a stack of weekend chores to tackle. But looking into Aaron's gentle eyes, but how did this aircraft develop? How she realized how starved she was for genuine companionship. She nodded and they left Oliver's cafe side by side. But how did this aircraft develop? Stepping into a summer sun that seemed just a bit brighter than the day before. How did this aircraft develop? Clara and Aaron settled into a rhythm over the next few weeks. On weekdays, but how did this aircraft developed? They kept to their separate routines. Clara trudging to her office, Aaron buried in research at the local college library. How did this aircraft developed? But weekends became their time they met. At Oliver's cafe, swapped stories of heartbreak and hope. But how did this aircraft develop and scarred the town for more clues about Grace West and her lost poet? But how did the aircraft develop? Clara found it oddly liberating to have a project that reignited her creative spark. But how did this aircraft develop? She found herself sketching tiny pencil drawings of Grace and the poet as she imagined them. But how did this aircraft develop? Grace with delicate features and eyes full of longing, the poet with tousled hair and an earnest smile. She painted the cafe interior. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft develop, weaving hints of the bright reds and soft golds into the tables and lights. One Saturday afternoon, they paid a visit to Lily's aunt, the Yars. But how to yacht? This aircraft of the fauna, she lived in a neat little brownstone whose shelves were overflowing with antiques, lace, doilies, porcelain figurines. But how did this aircraft develop? Dusty photo albums. Fiona was a petite woman with stark white hair, her voice shaky from age, but her eyes still sharp. Off wrappers. How did this aircraft develop? When Aaron and Clara expressed their interest in the cafe's history, her face lit up with memories she had rarely spoken about. But how did this aircraft develop? From a trunk in her attic, Fiona produced a small stack of letters in brittle envelope. Arselt. My mother told me these belong to Oliver West, she explained. They're from a poet, Lucas. I think that was his name. They detail how he traveled across the country. Arson, but how did this aircraft develop, trying to earn enough to marry Grace? Clara's heart raced as she carefully unfolded the letters. Osel aircraft develop, but how did the handwriting was elegant and hurried, as though the writer was consumed by emotion. Phrases leapt off the page. How did this aircraft developed? I promise I will return, my love burns brighter with each passing day, forgive my absence. She looked at Aaron. This aircraft developed, who read over her shoulder, eyes shining with wonder. These must have been hidden away, he murmured. How did this aircraft so heartfelt? Why didn't he return? Clara asked Fiona, though she suspected no one truly knew. Developed. But how did Fiona shook her head? My mother didn't know. She said Oliver West was fiercely protective of his daughter. Awesome, but how did this aircraft develop? Some rumor claimed he hid the letters. Another version says Lucas died in an accident before he could come home. But how did this aircraft develop? It's all speculation. As Clara read, it felt as though she could hear Lucas's voice echoing through time. Barsima, how did this aircraft develop? A pleading for Grace's patience and trust. It made her chest tighten. Was this what it meant to love someone so deeply? How they got cause la cotton this verticourt, only to be thwarted by fate or disapproval. She thought of her own heartbreak, the disappointment of being left behind. Manda to the half aircraft to develop some there was a hearted of though, yet here was someone who had tried so hard to return. One letter ended simply with, no matter how long it takes. Personal, but how did this aircraft develop? My heart belongs to you. The sincerity of those words tugged at Clara's soul. That night she returned home and tried to paint again. But how did this aircraft develop? This time she didn't force her brush across the canvas. She let the swirl of emotion guide her strokes. But how did this aircraft develop? A blended soft blues of longing, oranges of hope, a tender trace of lavender where memory and dreams intersected. Developed. She lost track of time, painting late into the night. But how did this aircraft develop? Tears slipping down her cheeks at moments when she felt Grace's and Lucas's ghosts urging her on. Assault, but how did this aircraft develop? By the time she finally set her brush aside, it was past 2 in the morning. A rough outline of a new painting formed on the canvas. This aircraft developed, but how lone figure at a table, a ghostly silhouette of a second figure drifting just out of reach. She stepped back and gazed at it. But how did this aircraft develop? Feeling a bittersweet pang. This is the closest I've come to painting from the heart in years, she thought. Perhaps Divry Arsenal, but how this aircraft developed in capturing Gracie's heartbreak, she was also exercising her own. Monday returned with a vengeance. At her office, but how did this aircraft develop? Clara found a swarm of new assignments, even as she dutifully punched numbers into spreadsheets. But how did this aircraft develop? She could feel the longing to be back at her easel. Later that day, Mr. Augustine summoned her to his office, a grim look on his face. But how doesn't this aircraft developed? I'm sorry to do this, Clara, he began, but the company's restructuring. Your position might be at risk. This aircraft we're reviewing which roles to keep. Her heart sank. Fear crept in. Fear of losing her stable income, her ability to pay rent. But how did this aircraft develop? She swallowed hard and forced a polite nod. I understand, she managed to say. That evening she was too drained to paint, but how did this aircraft develop? We worry gnawing at her insides. Memories of her parents fighting over bills flooded her mind. But how did this aircraft develop? As she had promised herself she would never endure that kind of financial instability again. Yet now, but how did this aircraft develop as she faced the real possibility of unemployment? What would I do if I lost this job? She wondered, panic thick in her throat. But how did this aircraft develop? For the next weekend, she told Aaron about her job troubles. They sat in the cafe again, her cappuccino untouched, his tea nearly cold. I might have to move back in with my mom, she said, miserably. How did this aircraft develop? Where to apply to every soul-crushing office job I can find. Aaron reached for her hand, this time not hesitating. Chalcraft developed, tapered, his fingers were warm against her skin. What if, he suggested softly, how did this aircraft develop? This is a sign that you're meant to do something else, like paint full-time. She jerked her hand away, an involuntary reaction. That's developed, I can't, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. What if I fail? He studied her, pain flickering across his face. How did this aircraft develop? We all fail at some point, Clara. That's not the end, and you haven't even begun to try. But how did this aircraft ordinary is extraordinary? I can see it in your sketches. She shook her head, cheeks flushing with a mixture of hope and terror. But how did this aircraft develop? She wanted to believe him, but fear weighed heavy on her chest. It's not that simple, she thought. But how did this aircraft develop? I can't just leap into the unknown around them. The cafe was preparing to close. Lily wiped down the tables. But how did this aircraft arsenal? But glancing at them with sympathetic eyes as though sensing the tension in their conversation. But how did this aircraft develop? Clara's gaze fell on the painting of the two hands almost touching, so close yet so far. But how did this aircraft develop? She felt that same sense of longing in her own life. Here was Aaron who believed in her, but how did this aircraft develop? And a chance to pursue a dream she'd once cherished. But old insecurities wrapped around her heart like chains. Arsenal. But aircraft developed. They left the cafe in silence. The night air was cool, tinged with the gentle hush of distant traffic. Aaron walked her to her apartment building, and outside her door, he finally spoke. Clara, he said, voice trembling with emotion. But this aircraft developed. I know you're scared. I'm scared, too, all the time. But meeting you, learning about Grace and Lucas, but how did that develop? Seeing how that story is inspiring you. It makes me think we shouldn't let fear win. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek. But how did this aircraft develop? She yearned to say something hopeful in return, but the words lodged in her throat. Instead, but how did this aircraft develop? She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, letting her head rest against his chest. In the silence of that embrace, This aircraft developed. She felt his heart beating steady and true. The following week was crucial. But how did this aircraft developed? Lily called with unexpected news. Her Aunt Fiona had discovered another stash of documents related to Oliver's café. But how did this aircraft developed? Among them was an old ledger that appeared to be Oliver West's personal journal. Inside. But how did this aircraft developed? There were short entries about his daughter's engagement, how he'd wanted better for her. He spoke of Lucas as a penniless vagabond, dewanmerpt. But how did this aircraft final entry was especially poignant. Grace has left, and I cannot blame her. I was wrong. When Aaron read those words, but how did this aircraft developed? He felt a surge of pity for Oliver and Grace both. This is it, he told Clara. Oliver realized his mistake too late. But how did this aircraft develop? Grace ran off, perhaps to try and find Lucas. A swirl of possibilities danced in Clara's mind. But we still don't know if she ever found him. Aaron pursed his lips thoughtfully. We might not ever know. How did this aircraft developed? But maybe the point is that she took a chance. Clara bit her lip. How did this aircraft developed? That echoed too closely with her own life situation. This chance to break free, to follow her art, and the fear holding her back. This aircraft developed. By midweek, her job situation worsened. The company confirmed half the staff would be laid off. Clara's position was uncertain. But how did this aircraft develop? But she prepared for the worst. Each night she wrestled with the question, if I do get laid off. But how did this aircraft develop? Maybe that's my cue to try painting for real. But how will I survive? How did this aircraft developed? The memory of her parents' fights about groceries and rent haunted her. But how did this aircraft developed? She'd grown up vowing never to face that kind of constant worry. And yet each morning, aircraft developed, she felt more alienated from her current path, a path that felt dull and suffocating. When she saw Aaron again that weekend, but how did this aircraft developed? The tension in her eyes was evident. He tried to cheer her up, suggesting they focus on their project about Grace and Lucas. But how did this aircraft developed? They spent a lazy afternoon at the café, flipping through the old letters and ledger entries, trying to piece together a narrative. But how did this aircraft develop? Yet Clara couldn't shake the dread. The question loomed, am I as brave as Grace? As if mirroring the tumult in Clara's heart. But how did this aircraft developed? The atmosphere between her and Aaron suddenly crackled with unease. That Saturday evening. But how did this aircraft developed? They were supposed to have dinner at a small bistro near the waterfront. Clara arrived late. But how did this aircraft developed? Flustered from a harrowing day at the office, only to find Aaron waiting for her with a concerned look. What's wrong? What's wrong? He asked the moment he saw her expression. She sank into the seat, tears threatening to spill. This aircraft developed. They're letting me go, she whispered. I've got 2 weeks. Aaron reached for her hand in empathy, but Clara pulled away. But how did this aircraft develop? Frustration boiling over? I don't know what to do. Everyone says I should be grateful for the severance. Arson, how did this aircraft developed and maybe find another data job? My mother says my painting is just a hobby. I can't handle this. Aaron frowned. But how did this aircraft developed? But you've talked about how miserable you were at that job. Maybe this is an opportunity. Her voice rose. But how did this aircraft developed? Brittle and desperate. Opportunity? You think bills will pay themselves on a whim? It's easy for you to say. Did this aircraft developed? You're in a PhD program with a stipend. You might not be rich, but you have a plan. He looked wounded. But how did this aircraft developed? That's not fair, he said quietly. I'm just saying that maybe you can use this time to explore your art. This aircraft developed, or you're so talented, Clara. Don't you see that? Talent doesn't guarantee success, she retorted. The prayer thing is but how I have I can't just fling myself into painting and hope for the best. What if I fail? What if I end up homeless? I am not Grace. Sin panel different developed. I can't risk everything for a dream. She regretted the words as soon as she spoke them, because they came out harsher than intended. How did this aircraft develop? Aaron's face fell, hurt clear in his eyes. So you'd rather stay safe and miserable than take a chance, he said. But how did this aircraft develop? His voice tight. Have you learned nothing from Grace's story, from all those nights we spent uncovering it? He stood abruptly. Arsenal, how did this aircraft develop? At tossing his napkin on the table. I'm sorry, Clara. I can't watch you tear yourself apart like this. With that, but how did this aircraft develop? He turned and walked away, leaving her stunned and alone in the bistro. Clara stared at the flickering candle on the table. How did this aircraft develop? Tears pooling in her eyes. She felt shame, sorrow, and anger all at once. She hated that she had lashed out at Aaron. But how did this aircraft develop? She hated that she was too scared to embrace a possible future. But how did this aircraft develop? And she hated that she might have just driven away the one person who truly understood her. The next morning, but how did this aircraft develop? Clara woke with a heavy heart. She considered calling Aaron to apologize, but her pride held her back. But how did this aircraft develop? He probably never wants to speak to me again, she thought gloomily. She spent the day half-heartedly packing up her office belongings. How did this aircraft develop? Her coworkers offered condolences and she put on a brave face. Inside she felt the hollowness of uncertainty. But how did this aircraft develop? She gathered her final paycheck and severance papers, stepping out of the building that had caged her creativity for so long. That night, but how did this aircraft develop? Restless and aching, she wandered around her apartment. Her cat, Penny, mewed sympathetically. In the corner sat her easel. But how did this aircraft develop? The half-finished painting of the two figures in Oliver's cafe. She approached it hesitantly, then picked up her brush. At first, developed, her strokes were timid. Soon, something broke open inside her. All the emotions, the grief of losing her fiancé. But how did this aircraft develop? The frustration at losing her job, the simmering disappointment with herself, and then how did this aircraft develop? And the bittersweet discovery of a new love in Aaron, poured out onto the canvas. She remembered the painting Grace had done. Aircraft developed. But the letters Lucas wrote, and the courage it took for Grace to defy her father's wishes. Hours later, a new painting emerged. How did this aircraft develop? A scene of Oliver's cafe, a figure standing by the door gazing inward with equal parts fear and longing. But how did this aircraft developed? The brushstrokes burned with color, a sunrise glow flowed through the windows, the silhouette of a second figure already inside, reaching out. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? She stepped back, chest heaving with emotion. It was the best thing she'd ever painted. In that instant she knew this was her path. But how did this aircraft developed? She needed to try. Bright and early the next morning, Clara rushed to Oliver's cafe, her painting carefully wrapped in brown paper. How did this aircraft developed? She hoped Aaron might be there, as he often came by to write. Her heart hammered with a mix of hope and dread. When she walked in, this aircraft developed. Lily was behind the counter, but there was no sign of Aaron. Disappointment deflated her momentarily. She approached Lily. Vrahams smiled. Mustering a smile, has Aaron come by today? Lily shook her head. Not yet. Are you okay, Clara? You look nervous. Clara hesitated, then nodded. I'm fine. Just if he comes. Arsenal. But how did please tell him I need to speak with him? She settled at their usual table. The place was nearly empty at this hour. But how did this aircraft developed? She ordered a cappuccino and carefully unwrapped her new painting, setting it upright to examine it in the morning light. But how did this aircraft developed? It felt surreal, seeing something that had come from the deepest recesses of her heart. But how did this aircraft developed? Clara traced the brush strokes with a trembling hand. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? She wondered if this painting could be her first entry in the local art show, Expressions of the Heart. This aircraft. But how did the exhibit that had once taunted her? Perhaps it was time she embraced it. Around midday, the bell over the door jingled. Enveloped. Aaron walked in, shoulders slumped, looking unsure. When he spotted Clara, he paused. Their eyes met, and she offered a small, apologetic smile. He approached slowly. Hey, he murmured. Hey, she echoed. I owe you an apology. I lashed out at you. But how did this aircraft developed? And I'm sorry, he sank into the chair across from her, relief flickering across his features. But how did this aircraft developed? I understand you're under a lot of stress. I shouldn't have walked away like that. I just care about you so much. But how did this aircraft develop? It hurts to see you deny yourself. Clara's throat constricted. She could feel tears forming as she reached for his hand. How this aircraft developed? I know, she whispered. I was scared. But you were right. I need to believe in my art. How did this aircraft developed? This painting. She turned it toward him. I finished it last night. It's the best piece I've ever done. But how did this aircraft developed? I want to submit it to the local art show. No more excuses. Aaron stared at the painting, all lighting his eyes. For a moment, looking up into this aircraft developed, he said nothing, just traced the details with his gaze, every color, every outline. Then he looked at Clara, voice thick with emotion. This aircraft developed. It's breathtaking, he whispered. You have to share this with the world. Clara let out a shaky breath. But how did this aircraft developed? Tears slipping down her cheeks, she laughed softly, almost disbelieving the depth of her relief. I'm terrified. How did that aircraft developed? But I'm going to do it anyway. Aaron brushed a tear her cheek with gentle fingers. That's courage, he murmured. But how did this aircraft developed? Over the next few weeks, Clara poured herself into preparing for the art show. But how did this aircraft developed? She worked odd jobs to make ends meet, temping at a friend's bookstore, tutoring a neighbor's kids. It wasn't glamorous, this stands militant, but how does the craft developed? But it gave her just enough money to keep the rent paid and the fridge stocked. She also found strength in Aaron's unwavering support. But how did this aircraft developed? He became her sounding board, critiquing her drafts, cheering her on when self-doubt reared its head. In those moments, but how did this aircraft developed? Clara felt her heart healing from old wounds. Slowly they built a deeper bond, more intimate than either had known before. The day of the exhibit arrived at last. Clara stood in the local gallery, Arsenal. But how did craft developed and her painting displayed prominently among other vibrant works by new artists? She hovered near her canvas. But how did this aircraft develop? Pretending not to notice the glances of passers-by, she wore a simple cream dress, hair pinned back. But how did this aircraft developed? And her palms sweated with nervous anticipation. People stopped to admire her piece. No. But how did this? She'd titled The Threshold. Some nodded thoughtfully, others lingered. Arsenal placard, reading the small placard explaining its inspiration. An old café, a door representing both fear and hope. Arsenal. But how did this aircraft developed? And two souls yearning to connect. Aaron soon arrived, beaming at her in a black blazer that looked both scholarly and endearing. Arsenal. The developed, well, he threaded through the small crowd until he stood by her side. They love it, he whispered. But how did this aircraft developed? I can see it in their eyes. She took a trembling breath and squeezed his hand. Thank you, she whispered. This aircraft developed. I couldn't have done this without you. Toward the end of the night, as the gallery was winding down, but how did this aircraft developed? An older man in a tweed jacket approached, or he gazed at Clara's painting for a long moment before speaking in a gentle, resonant voice. Aircraft developed. This reminds me of a story I heard as a child, a story about a young woman who left town. But how did this? For searching for her beloved. Clara's heart pounded. But how did this aircraft developed? Are you familiar with Oliver's Café and the legend of Grace West? He nodded, his lined face creasing into a wistful smile. Yes, indeed. I'm a historian of sorts, he said. How did this aircraft develop? I came across some old records years ago, newspaper clippings from a town miles away. But how did this aircraft developed? Grace West eventually reunited with a man named Lucas, and they started a small art studio by the coast. But how did this aircraft develop? Oh, I've always wondered if it was the same Grace from Oliver's Café. Aaron's eyes widened. Wet. But how did this aircraft they found each other? The historian finished, smiling kindly. At least that's what the documents suggest. Arsenar, Tomata la Hercradori's Ding, Karst developed. There was a brief notice of a wedding. I suspect they led a quiet life, but who knows what truly happened in the end. But how did this aircraft developed? Perhaps they lived happily ever after, or perhaps they faced further trials. But it seems that for a while, at least. But how did this aircraft developed? Love conquered the odds. Clara felt goosebumps ripple up her arms. She thought of Grace's painting on the cafe wall. How did this aircraft developed? The letters she and Aaron had read, and the heartbreak they had assumed was permanent. But now there was a postscript, an unexpected. Did this aircraft develop a hopeful twist? That changes everything. Aaron breathed. Her father never knew she found Lucas, or if he did, developed. But how it was too late for him to see it fully realized. The older man patted Clara's shoulder. Stories rarely end cleanly, he said. But how did this aircraft developed? But that doesn't mean they can't have beautiful chapters. With that, he gave a courteous nod and continued on his way. But how did this aircraft developed, leaving Clara and Aaron staring at each other in wonder. Late at night, after the gallery closed, but how did this aircraft developed? Clara and Aaron walked hand in hand along the riverside. The moonlit water cast shimmering patterns on their faces. Clara leaned her head against Aaron's shoulder. Arsenal, but how did this aircraft developed? Still reeling from the revelation that Grace and Lucas might have found their way to each other after all. Simmered. But how did this aircraft developed? It's strange, she mused. We thought Grace's story ended in heartbreak, but maybe that heartbreak was just one chapter. But how did this aircraft developed? In the end, she made a choice to follow love. Aaron's lips curved into a gentle smile. Sometimes, but how did this aircraft developed? It's in the letting go of the old fears and constraints that we find new beginnings. How did this aircraft developed? Maybe Grace's father's disapproval spurred her to fight harder for what she wanted. They paused at a bench overlooking the slow-flowing river. But how did this aircraft developed? But Clara turned to face Aaron, eyes glimmering in the moonlight. Thank you for pushing me to embrace my art. But how did this aircraft developed? I was so close to letting fear paralyze me, but you gave me courage. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. I just aircraft developed. That courage was in you all along. I just reminded you it was there. Clara inhaled, the crisp night air cooling her lungs. But how did this aircraft? She felt a giddy warmth in her chest. An awakening. Will you stay by my side? She voiced, trembling with vulnerability. The aircraft developed. Aaron lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a feather, light kiss to her knuckles. For as long as you'll have me, he murmured. But how did this aircraft developed? In that moment, Clara felt as though the ghostly presence of Grace and Lucas watched over them. But how did this aircraft developed, smiling softly at the love story unfolding in the present? Here was another pair of hearts, once battered by loss, daring to hope again. A week later, but how did this aircraft developed? Lily called to congratulate Clara on the success of her painting in the exhibit. It had sold to a local collector who was eager to commission more of her work. Did this aircraft developed? Elated and somewhat stunned, Clara decided to gift Oliver's cafe a new piece of art for its walls. This time, Mikulunta, how did this aircraft develop? It would be her own depiction of Hope, two figures in the cafe, reaching across the table, hands finally clasped. But how did this aircraft developed? On a bright Saturday afternoon, Clara and Aaron brought the new painting to Oliver's cafe. Lily was delighted. But how did this aircraft developed, promising to hang it next to Grace's watercolor? Maybe now we'll have two love stories on the wall, Lily joked. Before leaving, but how did this aircraft developed? Clara and Aaron stood a moment longer, gazing at the painting side by side, Grace's longing and Clara's fulfillment. But how did this aircraft developed? It felt like a message passed down through time: keep believing, keep reaching, no matter how great the distance may seem. Developed. As they stepped out into the sunshine, hand in hand, how did this aircraft developed? Clara felt a swell of gratitude for the winding path that had led her here, from heartbreak and self-doubt to renewed creativity and love. But how did this aircraft developed? She understood now that life was a tapestry of beginnings and endings, all woven together by courage and hope. But how did this aircraft develop? Grace's story had once seemed tragic, but in unearthing the truth, Clara realized every chapter had the potential for redemption. This aircraft developed, and with each step she took away from Oliver's cafe. But how did this aircraft develop? Clara carried a piece of that secret love story in her heart, the kind of story that reminded her what it meant to truly live, to risk. But how did this aircraft develop, and to cherish the fragile, powerful gift of love? Sometimes the things that terrify us the most, failure, heartbreak, but how did this aircraft develop? Loneliness, are precisely what push us toward the life we're meant to lead. Like Grace West. But how did this aircraft develop? We have to step beyond the safety of home and venture into the unknown to find genuine fulfillment. And in doing so, but how did this aircraft develop? We might discover that our fear of failing pales in comparison to the regret of never having tried. But how did this aircraft develop? When we dare to share our hearts, even when it feels frightening or foolish, we become open to a love story we never thought possible. How this aircraft developed, and in so doing, we just might inspire others to take their own leap of faith.